The air inside the Tudor court was thick with danger. Here, the wrong word could ruin you, and the right alliance could raise you higher than you ever dreamed. This was the glittering, perilous world of King Henry VIII, where ambition was a weapon, and survival was an art. Into this world stepped the Seymour family, a name few outside Wiltshire would have known at the time. They were not the oldest or grandest of England's nobility. Yet in a few short years, they would stand at the very heart of royal power. How? By playing the game better than almost anyone else. At the center of this story is Jane Seymour, a quiet lady-in-waiting whose modest charm would capture the king's heart and crown her Queen of England. But Jane's marriage to Henry was only the beginning. Her brothers, Edward and Thomas, and her sister Elizabeth, each found their own path through the treacherous corridors of Tudor politics, some rising to staggering heights, others falling to tragic ends. In this video, we will uncover how Jane rose from the shadows to become Henry's third wife, the immense pressures she faced to produce a male heir, and the dramatic events surrounding the birth of Prince Edward. We will follow Edward Seymour's rise to power as Lord Protector, wielding authority over England during the young king's reign, and see how his ambition led to his downfall. We will explore Thomas Seymour's reckless pursuit of influence, Elizabeth Seymour's skill at navigating shifting court alliances, and how the family's name became forever tied to both triumph and tragedy. This is a story of calculated moves, dangerous rivals, and the fine balance between ambition and survival. It is about how the Seymours changed the course of Tudor history, and how the price of power was often paid in blood. So if you've ever wondered what it truly took to survive and thrive in the most dangerous court in England, stay with us. Welcome to our channel Words of Time. And in this video we will journey deep into the rise and fall of the Seymour family, uncovering their secrets, their schemes, and the high-stakes game they played to win the king's favor. From Jane Seymour's quiet but calculated ascent to the throne, to the towering power and eventual ruin of her brother Edward, and the resilience of Elizabeth as she navigated the deadly tides of court politics, we'll reveal how ambition shaped their fate. This is not just a tale of crowns and titles. It's a gripping saga of survival in a world where one misstep could cost everything. The Tudor age in England was a time of constant change, danger, and opportunity, a period when political power was both glittering and treacherous. The backdrop was one of dynastic uncertainty, fierce factional rivalries, religious upheaval, and a monarchy that could make or unmake a subject's fortune in the space of a breath. This was the world into which the Seymour family of Wiltshire emerged, a family whose fortunes would rise from the status of respected country gentry to the highest reaches of the realm. Their climb was not inevitable. It was the result of a combination of timing, ambition, calculated alliances, and a willingness to navigate the volatile currents of the Tudor court. To understand the roots of their eventual prominence, one must first understand both the nature of Tudor politics and the careful cultivation of ambition within the Seymour household. At the beginning of the 16th century, England was ruled by a young and energetic Henry, the eighth king of that name. His reign began with optimism, but beneath the glamour of tournaments and courtly pageantry lay the ever-present question of succession and the fragility of dynastic security. Nobility and gentry alike were aware that the favor of the monarch could be their making, but that it could just as easily be withdrawn. The Seymour family, though not among the great noble houses, possessed a respected pedigree and a measure of local influence. They were landed gentry with estates in Wiltshire, particularly centered around Wolf Hall, and they had served the crown in military and administrative roles. In a realm where lineage was respected but active service to the monarch could elevate a family's position, the Seymours had the foundation upon which greater ambitions could be built. The Tudors' world was defined by shifting alliances, religious changes, and the precarious nature of royal marriages. Against this backdrop, ambitious families had to be alert to opportunities. The Seymours, like many in their class, were aware that their prospects could be enhanced through advantageous marriages, loyal service, and skillful courtly maneuvering. It was in this environment that the children of Sir John Seymour and Marjorie Wentworth were raised. Sir John himself was a man of standing, respected in his shire and occasionally called upon for military duties, such as in the campaigns against France. Marjorie Wentworth, his wife, came from a lineage connected to the nobility, and was celebrated in her youth for her beauty, which was noted by poets of the time. These qualities, established reputation, genteel manners, and notable connections, would become a legacy passed down to their children. From an early age, the Seymour children were instilled with an acute understanding of their position in society and the means by which it might be improved. Education played an important role in this upbringing, especially for the daughters, which was not yet universally the case among the gentry. The Seymour girls were taught not only the expected accomplishments of gentlewomen, needlework, music, and household management, but also the arts of conversation, comportment, and courtly diplomacy. These were not idle accomplishments. They were tools for advancement in the complex social and political world of the Tudor court. It was understood that a well-educated and well-mannered daughter could serve as a bridge to powerful alliances. Jane Seymour, who would later become the third wife of Henry VIII and Queen Consort of England, grew up in this carefully shaped environment. While she may not have had the same level of formal education as some of her contemporaries, her letters suggest she was literate but not a polished writer. She excelled in the qualities that mattered most to a monarch looking for a politically advantageous marriage. She was modest, devout, skilled in domestic management, and schooled in the virtues that were held in high esteem at the time. Her demeanor, described as gentle and obedient, masked a quiet resilience and a capacity for navigating the undercurrents of court life. These traits were not accidental. They were cultivated by a family keenly aware of the benefits such qualities could bring. Elizabeth Seymour, one of Jane's sisters, was similarly shaped by this environment of ambition tempered by decorum. While she did not achieve the same historical renown as Jane, Elizabeth's life also reflected the strategic considerations of her family. Her marriages were advantageous and connected her to influential circles, thereby extending the Seymour network of alliances. Each of the Seymour daughters was, in effect, a living investment for the family's fortunes, their personal qualities polished to meet the expectations of those in the royal orbit. The Tudor court itself was a theater in which every gesture, every conversation, and every friendship could carry political meaning. In this charged atmosphere, the Seymours prepared their children not just to participate, but to thrive. Their upbringing emphasized loyalty to the monarch, an ability to adapt to the changing winds of favor, and a readiness to seize the moment when it came. The ambition instilled in them was not the brash, untampered kind that might attract dangerous enemies. Rather, it was ambition clothed in the language of service, virtue, and propriety. The broader historical stage against which the Seymours rose to prominence was one of religious transformation and personal drama within the royal household. The king's desperate quest for a male heir, his break with Rome, and the subsequent establishment of the Church of England created both peril and opportunity. When Jane Seymour eventually entered the king's notice, it was partly because her qualities contrasted with those of his then-wife, Anne Boleyn, whose downfall would open the way for Jane's marriage to the king. But Jane's readiness for such a role, her comportment, her ability to navigate the treacherous politics of the moment, was the product of years of subtle preparation. In retrospect, it is clear that the Seymour family's initial position as gentry did not predestine them for the heights they would reach, but neither were they without resources. Their status provided them with a seat at the table, albeit on the periphery, and their ambition, discipline, and strategic approach to child-rearing positioned them to move inward toward the center of power. The upbringing of the Seymour daughters was not merely about personal refinement. It was about creating women who could function as key players in the intricate web of Tudor politics. The turbulence of the Tudor age meant that fortunes could change rapidly. One day a courtier might bask in royal favor, the next, he might face exile or worse. In such an environment, the Seymours' calculated cultivation of their children's qualities was a prudent strategy. The quiet confidence of Jane Seymour, the advantageous alliances made by Elizabeth Seymour, and the loyalty displayed by the family to the crown were all part of a deliberate pattern. They were playing a long game, one in which patience and preparation were as vital as boldness and opportunity. The world they inhabited was one where the personal was political, where a queen's manner at the dinner table could affect the course of policy, and where a whispered word in the right ear could shape the future of the realm. The Seymours understood this intimately. Their rise was not merely a product of luck or chance encounters. It was the result of a mindset fostered from the earliest years of childhood, a mindset that combined ambition with adaptability. that the family produced a queen consort who would give Henry VIII his long-desired male heir, and brothers who would become central figures in the regency of Edward VI, was no accident. It was the flowering of seeds planted in a time when the Seymours were still modest country gentry, watching the currents of the Tudor court with discerning eyes. In the restless heart of Tudor England, where the favor of the king was both a glittering prize and a perilous trap, the Seymour family stood on the threshold of a transformation that would alter not only their own destiny, but the course of the court itself. For years they had been a respectable house of the Wiltshire gentry, their name known in shire circles, their service to the crown appreciated but not celebrated on the grand stage. They were neither of ancient ducal lineage nor newcomers clawing at the gates of influence. Rather, they were in that subtle middle space where a family might, with the right touch of fortune and the right grasp of opportunity, rise into the inner sanctums of royal power. Few at the time could have guessed how swiftly that rise would come, or how profoundly it would shape the balance of power in Henry VIII's turbulent court. In the great houses and echoing chambers of the palace, factions moved like tides, sometimes quietly, sometimes with crashing force. There were the old aristocratic lines who clung to their inherited dignity, and there were the rising families whose ambitions burned hot, ready to grasp at the opportunities that the king's personal life and political maneuverings endlessly created. The Seymours had long been careful observers of these tides. They had built their position with patience, sending sons into service and daughters into well-planned marriages, waiting for a moment when one move might bring them into the very center of royal favor. That moment was drawing near, as inevitable and unstoppable as a storm gathering beyond the horizon. The man who ruled England was not merely a monarch. He was a force of will whose decisions could reorder the realm overnight. Henry VIII's reign was marked by sudden turns, alliances sealed and broken, courtiers lifted high and cast down, the kingdom's faith itself reshaped to match the crown's desires. In such a world, a family that could read the signs and act swiftly could transform their fortunes. The Seymours had watched the downfall of those who reached too greedily, or aligned themselves with a cause that the king's shifting mind later abandoned. They understood that advancement depended not only on gaining the monarch's attention, but on holding it in precisely the right way, offering what he sought at the moment he most desired it. That opportunity was drawing near, heralded by the growing disquiet in the royal marriage to Anne Boleyn. The court was alive with whispers, carried on the hushed voices of servants and in the guarded exchanges between courtiers. The king's longing for stability and a male heir was becoming more desperate with each passing year, and his once passionate union with Anne was souring under the weight of unmet expectations, political frictions, and her own forceful nature. The Seymours could see the change as clearly as others who lingered in the royal chambers, but they also saw something more, an opening that, if navigated with the utmost care, could place them in a position from which the family's influence might spread through every corridor of power. In the midst of this tension stood Jane Seymour, a figure of quiet composure whose presence was as far removed from Anne's sharp-edged brilliance as moonlight is from the blaze of the midday sun. She had been raised in the Seymour household with a blend of modesty and purpose, schooled in the virtues most admired by a king seeking domestic peace. Her nature was gentle, her manner respectful, and her appearance marked by the kind of serene grace that might soothe a weary heart. Yet beneath this modest exterior lay the strategic sensibility of a woman who understood her family's aims. Her very demeanor was part of the Seymours' long-laid plan, to present not a rival to the reigning queen, but an alternative so different that it could not fail to appeal to a king longing for a new chapter. The shift that was about to come was not the result of reckless ambition, but of a slow-burning design, years in the making. The Seymours did not rush forward. They waited for the court's atmosphere to ripen, for the king's attentions to waver, and for the inevitable gossip to prepare the ground. They understood that to move too soon would be to invite ruin, but to move too late would be to see the chance slip away into another family's grasp. Timing was everything, and the Seymours were poised like hunters who know the precise moment to release the arrow. When the turning point came, it would not announce itself with fanfare but with a series of seemingly small moments. A glance in a corridor, a respectful word in the presence chamber, a letter sent with careful deference. Such moments, however, would build into a force that could topple a queen and raise a new one. The Seymours were not naive about the dangers. They had seen how swiftly favor could turn to condemnation. Yet the prize before them was nothing less than a place in the heart of monarchy, a position from which brothers, sisters, and future generations could shape the destiny of the realm. The court in those days was like a great chessboard upon which each move had consequences far beyond the single piece in motion. The Seymours were about to place their most valuable piece, Jane, into a position that would change the game entirely. They knew the risks, but they also knew that the great shifts in Tudor politics came to those willing to act when opportunity and necessity converged. Theirs was not a gamble born of desperation, but a calculated step into the center of the king's gaze. In the months ahead, the air around the Seymours would thicken with expectation. Their name, once spoken lightly as belonging to respectable country gentry, would be carried on the lips of ambassadors and chroniclers, tied to the fate of the crown itself. Those at court who understood the flow of power would watch the Seymours closely, some with admiration, others with wariness, for they knew that when a family began to rise with such precision, the ground beneath everyone's feet could shift. And so, in the midst of the glittering halls, beneath the painted ceilings and among the richly dressed courtiers, the first tremors of change began to ripple outward. Few could yet see the full shape of the transformation that was coming, but all would feel its impact. The Seymours, patient and prepared, were about to step forward into the light. And with that step they would set in motion a chain of events that would shake the very foundations of the Tudor court. The court of Henry VIII was a stage upon which every actor had to understand their role, their timing, and the dangers of overstepping the script. It was a place of splendor and danger, where the fall of a single courtier could be as dramatic as their rise. Into this charged world came Jane Seymour, a woman who would ultimately occupy one of the most perilous and exalted positions in the kingdom, queen consort to the king himself. Yet when she first appeared at court, there was little to hint at the role she was destined to play. Her presence was quiet, her demeanor restrained, her conduct free of the flamboyance or calculated brilliance that had brought attention to her predecessor, Anne Boleyn. It was precisely this modest and gentle presentation that would become her greatest asset, for the Tudor court at that moment was primed for a change, and Jane Seymour, with the subtle backing and strategic guidance of her family, was the embodiment of that change. Jane was the daughter of Sir John Seymour of Wolf Hall in Wiltshire and Marjorie Wentworth, a woman celebrated in her youth for beauty and noble connections. Born into the English gentry, Jane grew up in an environment that valued loyalty to the crown, the careful maintenance of reputation, and the cultivation of qualities likely to appeal to those of higher rank. Unlike some of the more dazzling women who came to court, Jane did not have the benefit of an extensive humanist education. Her handwriting and spelling suggest a basic literacy rather than refined scholarship, yet her upbringing had emphasized other skills: domestic management, piety, obedience, and a capacity for pleasing company without drawing envy or suspicion. These virtues would prove far more valuable than classical learning in the circumstances she would later encounter. When Jane entered the king's household as a maid of honor to Queen Anne Boleyn, she was stepping into a court already roiling with tension. Anne's marriage to Henry, achieved after years of defiance against the Pope and the breaking of England from Rome, had promised a new era. But the promise had soured. The king's desperation for a male heir was no secret, and the queen's inability to produce one, coupled with her strong personality and sharp political engagement, had eroded her position. The court was full of factions, some still loyal to Anne, others eager to see her replaced. Jane's arrival was unremarkable enough at first, for the queen's ladies were numerous, and she did not immediately stand out as a rival. Yet her very ordinariness became part of her strength. She was not a figure who drew gossip or hostility in those early months. She simply occupied her place, attentive to her duties, reserved in her interactions, and courteous to all. It would be wrong to imagine that Jane's emergence as a potential queen was entirely accidental. The Seymour family understood court politics and recognized the growing instability of Anne's position. They had watched Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon collapse, had seen how quickly Anne's star had risen in Catherine's place, and now observed the same forces gathering against the second queen. The Seymours, though of lesser rank than the great noble families, were skilled in patience and positioning. They did not thrust Jane forward aggressively. Instead, they allowed her to be noticed gradually, letting her quiet grace speak for itself in contrast to the reigning queen's embattled presence. The meticulous nature of this strategy became apparent when the king's interest in Jane began to show. Accounts suggest that Henry first noticed her sometime in the late winter or early spring of the year that would see Anne's fall. By that time, Jane was already well coached in how to respond. Neither with the coyness that might be seen as calculated, nor with the eagerness that might suggest loose morals. One famous anecdote tells of Henry sending her a purse of coins, which she refused, stating that her honor was worth more than riches. Whether entirely factual or embellished by later chroniclers, the story captures the essence of the image Jane was cultivating. A woman of virtue, unattainable except through marriage, and respectful of both herself and the king. This presentation did not happen by chance. The Seymours knew that Henry's dissatisfaction with, and was rooted not only in her failure to bear a male heir, but in her forceful and sometimes confrontational manner. A woman who could offer the king a sense of peace, obedience, and the hope of the long-desired son would have a strong claim on his affections. Jane's behavior was therefore tailored to meet this need. She was unfailingly modest, demure in her speech, and careful never to speak against and openly, a tactic that allowed Henry to imagine her as untainted by intrigue while simultaneously highlighting the contrast between her demeanor and that of his wife. When Anne's enemies at court moved against her, Jane's position became pivotal. The Queen's arrest and subsequent trial for treason, adultery, and incest shocked even a court accustomed to swift reversals of fortune. Yet Jane remained in the background during these dramatic days, not openly celebrating her rival's fall, but instead maintaining a decorous silence. It was a calculated choice, preserving her image as a woman above the sordidness of court scandal. Within days of Anne's execution, Jane was betrothed to Henry, and shortly thereafter they were married in a quiet ceremony. The speed of the transition made clear that her relationship with the king had been carefully cultivated, though cloaked in the language of virtue and propriety. Becoming queen consort placed Jane in a position of immense influence, but also immense pressure. The expectations upon her were explicit. She was to provide Henry with the male heir he craved above all else. This was not simply a matter of personal desire. The question of the succession was of national importance, for without a legitimate son the Tudor dynasty itself was at risk. Jane would have been acutely aware of the fate of her predecessors, Catherine cast aside after 2 decades of marriage, and executed after less than 3 years, and she knew that her own security depended on fulfilling the king's most urgent wish. The pressure was not confined to the royal bedchamber. As queen, Jane was also expected to restore a sense of decorum and stability to a court that had been in turmoil. Henry valued her gentle influence and her apparent disinterest in political machinations, yet she was not without her own ambitions for her family. Almost immediately, the Seymours began to benefit from her position. Her brothers Edward and Thomas rose in prominence, receiving titles and offices. While Jane herself did not openly challenge the king's will, her family's growing influence showed that she understood the power of her role and was prepared to use it to secure their advancement. The task of producing an heir was a constant, unspoken presence in Jane's life. Each month without a pregnancy would have been a reminder of the precariousness of her situation. When she finally conceived, the event was celebrated throughout the realm. The Queen was closely attended, her health monitored with the utmost care, and prayers offered for the safe delivery of a son. The court and the country alike waited in a state of hopeful suspense. In the autumn of that year, Jane gave birth to a healthy boy, named Edward, fulfilling the king's long-held dream. Henry's joy was boundless. The birth of the prince was proclaimed as a triumph, and Jane was praised as the perfect wife and queen. Yet the fulfillment of her duty came at a terrible cost. Complications set in after the birth, and within less than 2 weeks Jane was dead. Her death was a profound personal blow to Henry, who would remember her as his true wife, the one who had given him the son he desired. For the Seymours, her passing did not end their influence. Edward would ascend the throne as a boy, with her brothers playing central roles in the regency, but Jane's own story was cut short at the moment of her greatest triumph. In retrospect, Jane Seymour's journey from an unremarkable maid of honor to Queen of England was the product of a deliberate and well-executed strategy, one that relied on her natural qualities of modesty and gentleness, but also on the careful management of her image by a family attuned to the rhythms of Tudor power. Her rise was neither a romantic accident nor a mere stroke of fortune. It was the result of understanding the king's desires, the court's needs, and the importance of timing. She entered the stage quietly, played her part with precision, and left an enduring mark on the dynasty through the son she bore. The pressures she faced, to embody an ideal of feminine virtue, to secure the future of the Tudor line, to navigate the treacherous waters of court politics without appearing to do so, were immense, and they shaped every choice she made. In meeting those expectations, she achieved what neither of her predecessors had managed, but at the cost of her own life, sealing her legacy as both the most successful and the most tragic of Henry's queens. The birth of Prince Edward in the autumn of the year was the moment toward which Jane Seymour's entire queenship had been moving. From the day she married Henry VIII, her worth in the eyes of the king and the realm had been tied to the question of whether she could give England a legitimate male heir. For more than 2 decades, this question had haunted the Tudor dynasty. Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, had borne him only one surviving child, the Princess Mary, and his second wife, Anne Boleyn, had produced the Princess Elizabeth but no son. The absence of a male heir was not merely a personal disappointment for the king. It was a matter of dynastic survival, threatening the stability of the realm and the continuation of the Tudor line. In this charged context, Jane's pregnancy was more than a private joy. The news of her condition was met with rejoicing in court and country alike. Prayers were offered in churches, and Henry's mood softened toward all who surrounded him. The king spared no expense in ensuring the queen's comfort, arranging for her to have the finest physicians, midwives, and attendants. Her lodgings were altered to accommodate her confinement in accordance with tradition, a period in which the queen would be secluded from public view to rest and prepare for childbirth. The stakes could not have been higher, and every precaution was taken to guard her health. In early October, Jane went into labor. The process was long and arduous, lasting several days. Contemporary accounts suggest that the birth was difficult, and the toll it took on Jane's body would soon become tragically clear. But when on the 12th of October, the cries of a healthy infant boy filled the royal apartments, all else was momentarily forgotten. The child, Edward, was the embodiment of Henry's deepest wish, a legitimate son to inherit the throne. His arrival secured the succession in a way that no daughter, however capable, could in the eyes of the 16th century world. The celebrations that followed were lavish. Bonfires were lit across the kingdom, bells rang in every parish, and proclamations of the prince's birth were read aloud in towns and villages. At court, the atmosphere was one of unrestrained triumph. Nobles and courtiers came to offer their congratulations, and foreign ambassadors wrote home describing the joy that swept through England. The christening was held with the grandeur befitting the heir to the throne. The Princess Mary stood as godmother, and the infant, wrapped in cloth of gold, was presented with all the ceremonial splendor that the Tudors could muster. For Jane, the moment must have been one of profound satisfaction. She had achieved what no other wife of Henry had been able to give him. In the eyes of the king, she had fulfilled her destiny completely. Yet even as these celebrations were taking place, Jane's health was failing. The protracted labor had left her weakened, and within days she began to show signs of infection, likely puerperal fever, a common and often fatal complication in an age before modern medicine. At first, the court hoped she might recover. The king visited her frequently, speaking with unusual gentleness, and the physicians tried every remedy at their disposal. But as the days passed, it became clear that the queen was not improving. On the 24th of October, less than 2 weeks after giving birth, Jane Seymour died in her chambers at Hampton Court. She was in her late 20s, a young woman whose life had reached its highest point only to be extinguished almost immediately afterward. The speed of her decline shocked the court. Only days earlier she had been hailed as the savior of the dynasty. Now she was gone, leaving behind an infant son and a grieving king. Henry's mourning for Jane was deep and sincere. Though he would marry 3 more times, he would later refer to her as his true wife, the one who had given him the male heir he desired above all else. He ordered that she be buried with the highest honors in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, and he ensured that when his own time came, he would be laid to rest beside her. In death, Jane occupied a place of singular importance in his affections, and in the history of the Tudor dynasty. For the Seymour family, Jane's triumph and her sudden death brought both reward and responsibility. Her brothers Edward and Thomas had already begun to rise in favor during her queenship, but the birth of the prince, and the fact that Jane was no longer there to mediate the king's attention, placed them in a unique position. Edward Seymour, in particular, would see his fortunes advance dramatically. As the uncle of the future king, he would hold a place of influence no other man at court could rival once Henry was gone. In the immediate aftermath of Jane's death, the Seymours were careful to maintain their standing without appearing to exploit the tragedy. They understood that their power now rested on the life of the tiny prince, and they devoted themselves to his care and protection. When Henry died and Edward ascended the throne as a boy of only 9 years old, it was Edward Seymour who would become Lord Protector, effectively ruling England during the young king's minority. The foundation for this extraordinary power had been laid in those days of joy and grief in October, when Jane's body lay still but her legacy breathed in the cradle. Jane's story, compressed into so brief a span, was marked by an almost theatrical symmetry. Her rise had been quiet, her reign short, her triumph absolute, and her end swift. She had avoided the political pitfalls that had destroyed her predecessors, had never openly crossed the king, and had presented herself always as the obedient, virtuous consort. In return, she had given Henry the one thing he wanted above all: a son to carry the Tudor name into the next generation. That achievement alone was enough to secure her place in history, but the manner of its arrival, shadowed by her own death, lent it a tragic grandeur. The image of Jane that endured in the Tudor imagination was shaped as much by her final act, dying in the service of the dynasty, as by her conduct in life. She became a symbol of the ideal Tudor queen: modest, loyal, fruitful, and self-sacrificing. In truth, her life had been far more complex, guided by careful family strategy and the delicate navigation of court politics. But in the public memory, she was remembered above all as the mother of Edward VI, the woman who had given England its long-awaited heir and paid for it with her life. Thus, in the space of just over a year, Jane Seymour transformed both her own fortunes and those of her family. Her marriage to Henry VIII elevated the Seymours from gentry to the highest ranks of nobility. The birth of Prince Edward secured their influence for a generation. Even in her absence, the shadow of her achievement loomed large, shaping the politics of the realm, and ensuring that the name Seymour would be linked forever to the fate of the Tudor crown. The joy of the prince's birth and the sorrow of the queen's passing were bound together in the minds of all who witnessed them, a reminder of how swiftly triumph and tragedy could follow one another in the dangerous world of the Tudor court. Elizabeth Seymour's life unfolded at the intersection of personal ambition, family loyalty, and the volatile politics of the Tudor court. She was born into the same world as her more famous sister, Jane Seymour, but where Jane's story was defined by a meteoric rise and a sudden, tragic end, Elizabeth's was shaped by longevity, adaptability, and a gift for surviving and even thriving in the aftermath of seismic shifts. Her role as sister to a queen and aunt to a king placed her in an extraordinarily privileged position, yet one that demanded constant vigilance. In a court where a single misjudged alliance could lead to ruin, Elizabeth navigated her path with a combination of strategic marriages, careful public conduct, and the ability to reposition herself as the winds of power changed direction. Born into the Seymour family of Wolf Hall in Wiltshire, Elizabeth was raised in an environment that encouraged loyalty to kin and a sharp understanding of the political uses of marriage. The Seymours were members of the landed gentry rather than the high aristocracy, but their fortunes would change dramatically through the rise of Jane as Henry VIII's third wife. Before that ascent, Elizabeth had already entered into the marriage market, a place where alliances could be crafted as carefully as treaties. Her choices, and the choices made for her, would be influenced first by her family's ambitions and later by the realities of her own survival. The defining transformation in Elizabeth's status came with Jane's marriage to Henry in the year that saw the fall of Anne Boleyn. Overnight, the Seymour name became one of the most powerful in England, and Elizabeth's value as a marital prize increased sharply. She was no longer merely the daughter of a respectable gentry house. She was now the sister of the Queen and, in due course, would become the aunt of the long-desired male heir. in the rigidly hierarchical society of Tudor England. This connection gave her an unparalleled advantage in negotiating her future. It also placed her under intense scrutiny. Every move she made could reflect on the Queen and later, on the royal child. Elizabeth's first marriage was to Sir Anthony Uhtred, a knight of notable service, particularly in the north of England. At the time, this was a respectable and advantageous match, aligning her with a man whose loyalty to the crown was unquestioned and whose military reputation was solid. The union provided her with a degree of security, as well as practical experience in managing estates and navigating the social obligations of a knight's wife. Her life during this period was far removed from the glamour and intrigue of the central court, but it laid a foundation for the skills she would later employ in more politically charged environments. The death of Sir Anthony left Elizabeth a widow, and it was at this juncture that her position as the Queen's sister became a decisive factor. The Seymours were now at the height of their influence, and Elizabeth's remarriage became a matter of both personal and familial strategy. She entered into her second marriage with Gregory Cromwell, the only son of Thomas Cromwell, Henry VIII's chief minister and one of the most powerful men in the kingdom. This alliance was nothing short of brilliant from a political standpoint. It linked the Seymour family directly to the man who had orchestrated Anne Boleyn's downfall, and who was now steering the machinery of government. The match was mutually advantageous. For Thomas Cromwell, marrying his son to the Queen's sister brought him into the extended royal family, and shored up his position with the king. For the Seymours, it cemented an alliance with the man whose political skill was instrumental in securing Jane's marriage to Henry in the first place. Elizabeth's role in this marriage was to embody the connection between two dominant factions at court, and she fulfilled it with tact. While the union was relatively short-lived due to Gregory's early death, it produced children, and left Elizabeth in possession of valuable connections. The political landscape of the Tudor court, however, was never static. Thomas Cromwell's fall from favor and subsequent execution in the year that followed Gregory's death was a stark reminder of how quickly fortunes could turn. For Elizabeth, the collapse of the Cromwell Alliance could have been disastrous. Yet she demonstrated a talent for adaptation that would become the hallmark of her career. Rather than clinging to a fallen faction, she repositioned herself, drawing on her identity as the king's sister-in-law and the aunt of his heir to maintain relevance and security. Her third marriage, to John Powlett, Lord St. John, later Marquess of Winchester, further illustrates her ability to choose alliances wisely. The Powlett family was long established in the peerage, with substantial lands and influence, and this match restored Elizabeth to the upper tier of the nobility after the turbulence of the Cromwell downfall. Through this union, she secured not only her own future but also that of her children, integrating them into one of the most enduringly successful aristocratic families in England. Throughout these shifts, Elizabeth remained a figure of some subtlety. Unlike her brothers Edward and Thomas, who became central players in national politics during the reign of King Edward VI, she did not seek to wield overt political power. Her influence was exercised through her marriages, her patronage, and her capacity to act as a bridge between competing factions. This was a deliberate choice, and it kept her from the kind of direct confrontation with the king or his ministers that had destroyed so many others. As the aunt of King Edward VI, Elizabeth's position during his minority was delicate. The regency was dominated by her brothers, first Edward Seymour as Lord Protector and later Thomas Seymour in his own bid for influence, but both met violent ends. Edward was overreaching and ultimately executed for treason. Thomas was embroiled in scandal and also executed. Elizabeth had to navigate the fallout from these familial catastrophes with extreme care. She did so by emphasizing her loyalty to the crown, and by maintaining her distance from her brother's more reckless ventures. This restraint allowed her to preserve her standing at court, even as the Seymour name became tarnished by association with political miscalculation and intrigue. Her survival into the reign of Queen Mary and later Queen Elizabeth was a testament to her skill. Both queens had reasons to view certain members of the Seymour family with suspicion. Yet Elizabeth herself avoided the harsh reprisals that befell others. She understood the importance of adapting not only to shifts in monarch, but to changes in the ideological currents of the court. From the Protestant reforms of Edward's reign to the Catholic restoration under Mary and back to Protestantism under Elizabeth I. Her marriages, her comportment, and her alliances were all calibrated to avoid giving offense or creating enmity she could not afford. What emerges from the record of Elizabeth Seymour's life is the portrait of a woman who mastered the art of calculated survival. She was never the most flamboyant or notorious figure at court, nor did she leave behind a trail of dramatic confrontations. Instead, she embodied a quieter form of political intelligence, one that valued endurance over glory. Through 3 marriages, each to men of significant but differing political alignments, she ensured that her fortunes rose with the prevailing tide. She managed to remain connected to the center of power without ever being consumed by its dangers. In the broader tapestry of Tudor history, Elizabeth's story complements that of her sister Jane. Jane's life was brief, her triumph absolute, her legacy bound to the birth of a king. Elizabeth's was long, her triumphs measured, her legacy defined by the ability to remain standing when others had fallen. As the sister of a queen and the aunt of a king, she moved in rarefied circles, but it was her adaptability, her willingness to shift alliances, to marry strategically, and to read the political climate with precision, that ensured her survival. In a court where blood ties to the monarch could be as perilous as they were advantageous, Elizabeth Seymour's life stands as an example of how quiet strategy could succeed where bold ambition often failed. Elizabeth Seymour's life after the death of her sister Jane, and the later downfall of her brother Edward Seymour, was a masterclass in resilience and careful navigation of Tudor politics. She had begun her ascent as part of a family whose sudden rise was tied directly to Jane's marriage to Henry VIII. But Jane's death in childbirth in the year 1537 left the Seymours without their most direct link to the king. Many families would have faded from influence under such circumstances, particularly in a court where power was so often tied to proximity to the monarch. Elizabeth, however, proved that she could retain her place even without the living presence of the queen to shield her. At first, the family's continued strength rested on the survival of Jane's infant son, Edward, whose position as heir to the throne ensured that his maternal uncles and aunts remained important. Elizabeth understood that this link, though vital, was not enough by itself to secure her personal influence. She recognized that court politics were unstable, and she would need to adapt her alliances, roles, and even her public image to survive. Her marriages became her most important tools in maintaining her status. Her early marriage to Sir Anthony Uhtred had tied her to a respected military figure, giving her a foundation of honor and respectability. After his death, she did not waste time in securing a second match, this time to Gregory Cromwell, son of Thomas Cromwell, the king's most trusted minister. This marriage was a strategic triumph, binding her to the most powerful political figure in England after the king himself. It demonstrated her ability to align herself with dominant factions, a skill that would become her hallmark. But political winds could change swiftly in Henry's court. The Cromwell Alliance, once so promising, crumbled when Thomas Cromwell fell from favor and was executed. Many connected to him were ruined, but Elizabeth weathered the storm. Part of her resilience came from her careful conduct. She was known neither for scandal nor for overt political scheming, which allowed her to avoid the king's wrath. She leaned instead on her identity as Jane Seymour's sister and Edward's aunt, a role that remained respectable and useful to the crown. Her third marriage, to John Powlett, Lord St. John, later Marquess of Winchester, brought her into one of the most enduringly influential noble families in England. The Powletts were politically adaptable, serving successive monarchs with loyalty regardless of religious or factional shifts. This match not only restored Elizabeth to a secure and noble position, but also linked her to a network that was skilled at survival. Through this marriage, she anchored herself within a family whose political resilience matched her own. When Henry VIII died and young Edward became king, Elizabeth's brothers, particularly Edward Seymour, rose to positions of immense authority. Edward was named Lord Protector, effectively ruling England during the boy king's minority. This should have been the height of the Seymour family's power, and for a time, it was. Elizabeth's standing was naturally elevated as the sister of the Protector and aunt of the king. Yet she did not allow this favorable position to lull her into complacency. She must have known that such concentrated power in her brother's hands could provoke jealousy and resistance among other nobles, and that a fall could come as quickly as a rise. Her foresight was justified. Edward Seymour's dominance created enemies, and eventually his political missteps and perceived arrogance led to his arrest and execution. This was a perilous moment for Elizabeth. Many in her position, closely tied to a disgraced and executed figure, would have seen their fortunes collapse alongside his. However, Elizabeth had prepared for such contingencies through the strength of her marriage alliances and her reputation for discretion. She had not been publicly involved in her brother's policies, nor had she overstepped into areas of governance that could have made her a target. This separation of her identity from her brother's political actions allowed her to survive his fall with her influence largely intact. Elizabeth's resilience after her brother's execution was also due to her deep understanding of the Tudor court's unwritten rules. She avoided any appearance of harboring resentment against the crown for Edward's death, instead presenting herself as a loyal subject to the reigning monarch. She shifted her focus away from the volatile factional struggles that had ensnared her brothers, and concentrated on maintaining her position through loyalty, household management, and selective patronage. In doing so, she ensured that she remained useful without appearing threatening. Even as religious and political tides shifted dramatically under successive rulers, Edward VI's Protestant reforms, Mary I's Catholic restoration, and Elizabeth I's re-establishment of Protestantism, Elizabeth adapted. This flexibility was essential to her survival. Many nobles and courtiers fell victim to the changing faiths of the monarchs they served, but Elizabeth did not allow her religious stance to become a point of vulnerability. Whether by genuine moderation or careful discretion, she avoided making herself a symbol of any one religious faction, thereby keeping herself acceptable. By the time she reached the later stages of her life, Elizabeth had lived through the reigns of multiple monarchs, the execution of her sister's rival in Bullen, the death of her sister Jane, the birth of a king, the destruction of her brother Thomas Seymour, and the dramatic fall of her brother Edward Seymour. In each of these turning points, she demonstrated an ability to absorb the shock of loss and reorient herself to the new balance of power. This capacity for self-preservation was not mere passivity. It required active calculation, a keen awareness of courtly undercurrents, and the discipline to avoid the kinds of ambition that could prove fatal. Her story offers a contrast to that of her brothers. Where Edward and Thomas reached for power and fell, Elizabeth ensured her survival by never being too closely associated with the policies or schemes that could bring a person down. She did not attempt to wield direct political authority. Instead, she influenced events indirectly, through her marriages, her kinship to the monarch, and her connections within noble society. This made her less visible as a political actor, but far more durable as a court figure. In the end, Elizabeth Seymour's ability to maintain influence long after Jane's death, and despite her brother's eventual execution, came down to three core strengths: strategic alliance building, careful management of her public image, and a willingness to adapt to each new political reality. She never allowed herself to become entirely dependent on one source of power, whether it was a royal sibling, a politically dominant husband, or a particular faction. This diversification of her connections gave her a safety net when any one alliance failed. Her life stands as a reminder that in the Tudor court, survival was itself a form of triumph. Many who once stood at the pinnacle of influence were destroyed by the very proximity to power that had elevated them. Elizabeth Seymour, however, managed to remain not only standing but respected, her reputation largely untarnished by the scandals and executions that claimed so many of her contemporaries. She moved through one of the most dangerous political environments in English history with a steadiness that was rare among those so closely tied to the throne. In this way, her quiet resilience became her greatest legacy. Edward Seymour's rise to the height of Tudor power, and his catastrophic fall stand as one of the most vivid illustrations of both the opportunities and the perils of the mid-16th century English court. His ascent was spectacular, his authority almost unprecedented for a non-royal. Yet his end was as brutal as it was sudden. The story is inseparable from the circumstances of his birth, his connection to the throne through his sister Jane Seymour, and the political climate of the Tudor world in which ambition and danger were constantly intertwined. Born into the relatively modest but respectable gentry of Wiltshire, Edward Seymour's early life offered few indications that he would one day control the machinery of the English state. The Seymour family's fortunes changed decisively when his sister Jane caught the attention of King Henry VIII. Jane's quiet manner, combined with the political maneuverings of her brothers and allies, led to her marriage to the king in the year 1536, following the spectacular downfall of Anne Boleyn. Jane's marriage brought the Seymours into direct royal favor, and the birth of her son Edward in the year 1537 cemented their influence. When Jane died shortly after childbirth, the Seymours might have slipped from the forefront of power. However, the existence of the king's long-desired male heir ensured that Jane's brothers, Edward foremost among them, retained prominence. Edward Seymour rose steadily through the ranks, gaining military distinction during campaigns in France and Scotland. His victories, such as the successful assault on Boulogne in the year 1546, bolstered his reputation as both a soldier and a statesman. By the time of Henry VIII's death in January of the year 1547, Edward Seymour was already one of the most trusted and visible figures at court. Henry's death set the stage for Edward's extraordinary leap to the pinnacle of authority. The new king, Edward VI, was only 9 years old. His minority necessitated a regency, and the late kings had provided for a council of equals to govern collectively. Yet Edward Seymour had no intention of allowing power to be dispersed. Through careful preparation, charm, and the cultivation of support among key nobles, he maneuvered himself into the role of Lord Protector, effectively the sole ruler of England in his nephew's name. This consolidation of power was not achieved without resistance. The will's stipulation for shared governance had been designed to prevent precisely such a concentration of authority. However, Seymour's combination of military prestige, royal connection, and political alliances enabled him to overcome opposition. He secured the backing of figures such as Archbishop Thomas Cranmer and Sir William Paget, and he exploited his role as the king's maternal uncle to present himself as the most natural guardian of the realm. Within months of Henry's death, Seymour's authority was nearly absolute, and he was elevated to the title of Duke of Somerset. As Lord Protector, Edward Seymour wielded power unmatched by any subject in England. His responsibilities encompassed all matters of state: foreign policy, domestic administration, religious reform, and the management of the young king's upbringing. In religious matters, he pursued a course of Protestant reform, accelerating the changes begun in the latter years of Henry's reign. Under his direction, the English Church adopted new liturgical practices, including the introduction of the Book of Common Prayer, which would leave a lasting mark on English religious life. In foreign affairs, Seymour's ambitions were no less expansive. He sought to unite England and Scotland through the marriage of Edward VI to the infant Mary, Queen of Scots, a policy that became known as the Rough Wooing. This aggressive courtship was enforced by military campaigns, culminating in the Battle of Pinkie in the year 1547, a decisive English victory. Yet while the battle showcased Seymour's military skill, it failed to secure the desired marriage alliance. The Scots instead sent Mary to France, aligning themselves with England's continental rival. Domestically, Seymour faced significant challenges. The mid-Tudor period was marked by economic strain, social unrest, and the lingering effects of religious upheaval. Inflation, driven by debasement of the coinage, eroded the living standards of ordinary people, while enclosure of common lands provoked widespread resentment among the rural population. In the summer of 1549, discontent erupted into two major uprisings: the Western Rebellion in Devon and Cornwall, fueled by opposition to religious reform, and Kett's Rebellion in Norfolk, driven by grievances over land and governance. Seymour's handling of these crises was mixed. While the rebellions were eventually suppressed, often with brutal force, their occurrence exposed the fragility of his hold on the kingdom. His reputation as a reformer sympathetic to the poor had been one of his political strengths, but the rebellions undermined that image. Moreover, his reliance on military solutions and his failure to address underlying grievances alienated both commoners and the nobility. At court, Seymour's position was increasingly precarious. His personal style of leadership, often characterized as aloof and overconfident, bred resentment among his fellow counselors. His decision-making was sometimes impulsive, and he had a tendency to sideline those whose advice he considered inferior. This alienated powerful figures who might otherwise have been his allies. Among these was John Dudley, Earl of Warwick, a man of considerable political skill, who would eventually become Seymour's chief rival. The seeds of Seymour's downfall were sown in these years of unchallenged authority. His concentration of power, while effective in the short term, left him vulnerable to a concerted opposition. By late 1549, discontent among the nobility had reached a tipping point. Dudley and other councillors orchestrated a coup against the Lord Protector, seizing control of the king's person, and accusing Seymour of mismanagement and abuse of power. In October of that year, Seymour was arrested and sent to the Tower of London. Although he was released in early 1550, his return to power was brief and incomplete. His enemies remained vigilant, and his political capital was depleted. The final blow came in 1552, when he was accused of plotting to regain the Protectorship by force. Whether the charges were entirely justified remains debated, but in the brutal calculus of Tudor politics, mere suspicion was often enough to seal one's fate. In January of that year, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, was executed on Tower Hill. His death marked the end of the Seymour family's dominance at the heart of government, though his nephew remained king for several more years. For Elizabeth Seymour, their sister, and for the rest of the family, his fall was a stark reminder of the fragility of power in the Tudor era. The same court that had raised them so high through the marriage of Jane and the birth of Edward could just as quickly destroy them. The story of Edward Seymour's rise and fall encapsulates the volatile nature of Tudor politics. His ascent as Lord Protector demonstrated how quickly fortunes could change when ambition was matched with opportunity. His wielding of immense authority showed the scope of what was possible for a subject in the absence of a strong, adult monarch. Yet his downfall revealed the inherent dangers of concentrating too much power in one person's hands. In a court where loyalty was often conditional and alliances fragile, the line between unrivaled authority and fatal vulnerability was perilously thin. Edward Seymour's legacy is thus twofold. On one hand, he left an indelible mark on the religious and political landscape of mid-16th century England, advancing Protestant reforms and pursuing bold foreign policies. On the other, his fate stands as a cautionary tale about overreach, hubris, and the inability to navigate the treacherous undercurrents of court politics. For the Seymours as a family, his fall was a turning point from which they would never fully recover their former preeminence. The story of the Seymour family in the Tudor period is one of both extraordinary elevation and perilous fragility, a narrative that draws together the lives of siblings whose ambitions and strategies placed them at the very center of English history. The collective impact of Jane Seymour, Elizabeth Seymour, and Edward Seymour, along with the shadow cast by their executed brother Thomas, left an imprint on the mid-16th century that is still studied for what it reveals about the nature of power, loyalty, and survival under the Tudors. Their intertwined fates reflect the high stakes of the court in an age when proximity to the throne could raise a family to unprecedented heights, but could also destroy them with terrifying swiftness. The rise of the Seymours began with a stroke of fortune that seemed to come out of nowhere. The family were respectable but far from the highest ranks of the nobility. They held land, enjoyed a position of gentry standing, and were connected through service to the crown, but they were not among the great magnates who traditionally shaped royal policy. Jane Seymour's emergence as a potential bride for Henry VIII in the year 1536 changed all of that. Her ability to quietly navigate the treacherous politics surrounding the downfall of Anne Boleyn and position herself as the king's next wife was not simply a matter of luck. It was aided by her brothers and her family's capacity to remain outwardly neutral in public quarrels, while working carefully behind the scenes. Jane's marriage to Henry transformed the Seymours overnight. Her demeanor, which contrasted sharply with the fiery temper and boldness of Anne Boleyn, was exactly what the king desired at that moment in his life. She fulfilled her most important duty by giving birth to a male heir, the future Edward VI, in the autumn of 1537. This was the moment of the family's ultimate triumph. Yet it came at the cost of Jane's life, as she died shortly after childbirth. Her death removed the family's direct advocate within the king's bedchamber, but her achievement of producing a male heir ensured that her brothers and sisters would remain tied to the throne. Edward Seymour, as the eldest surviving brother, quickly became the head of the family, and moved to consolidate the advantages Jane had brought them. He was a skilled soldier, having already won distinction in Henry's campaigns, and he leveraged both military prestige and his relationship to the king's son to gain prominence at court. His marriage alliances, his ability to command loyalty among fellow nobles, and his calculated self-presentation as a loyal servant of the crown all contributed to his rise. Thomas Seymour, the younger brother, pursued advancement with a more flamboyant and often reckless style. He sought influence through charm, personal daring, and advantageous matches, including his marriage to the Dowager Queen Catherine Parr. His ambitions led him into dangerous territory, particularly in his dealings with the young Princess Elizabeth, and in schemes to gain more direct control over the boy king. Thomas's boldness, unchecked by the caution that marked some of his siblings, ultimately brought about his ruin. He was arrested and executed for treason, an event that revealed just how thin the line was between power and death in the Tudor world. Elizabeth Seymour, though less overtly a political actor than her brothers, demonstrated perhaps the greatest longevity and skill in the art of survival. She navigated the court through a series of strategic marriages, first to Sir Anthony Uhtred, then to Gregory Cromwell, the son of the king's most powerful minister, and later to John Powlett, Lord St. John, who would become Marquess of Winchester. Each marriage tied her to influential families, and allowed her to remain within the inner circles of power, without taking the kind of direct political risks that destroyed her brothers. Elizabeth's position as Jane's sister and Edward's aunt provided her with enduring prestige, and her discretion kept her from becoming a target even during the family's lowest moments. The pinnacle of the Seymour family's influence came with the death of Henry VIII in January 1547. The young Edward VI was only 9 years old, and a regency was required to govern in his name. Edward Seymour, already a leading figure, maneuvered himself into the role of Lord Protector, effectively becoming the ruler of England. His authority was enormous. He controlled the king's person, directed the kingdom's foreign and domestic policy, and oversaw a sweeping program of Protestant reform. He led military campaigns, including the victory at the Battle of Pinkie against the Scots, and pursued an ambitious plan to unite England and Scotland through marriage. However, the very scale of Edward's authority made him vulnerable. His centralization of power alienated other members of the Regency Council, and his handling of economic unrest and rebellion drew criticism. In 1549, the kingdom faced two major uprisings: the Western Rebellion in Devon and Cornwall, protesting religious changes, and Kett's Rebellion in Norfolk, sparked by economic grievances. Both were suppressed, but the upheavals weakened Edward's political standing. His rival, John Dudley, Earl of Warwick, exploited the discontent to orchestrate his removal from power. Edward Seymour was arrested, briefly released, then arrested again, and in January 1552 he was executed. For the Seymours as a family, Edward's fall was a devastating blow. It removed their leader, destroyed their monopoly on the king's council, and left them politically exposed. Yet even in the aftermath, they did not disappear entirely from the historical stage. Elizabeth's careful positioning and the lingering respect accorded to Jane as the mother of Edward VI allowed the family name to retain some dignity. When one steps back to consider the collective impact of the Seymour siblings, it becomes clear that they shaped the mid-Tudor period in significant ways. Jane's marriage altered the succession by providing the male heir Henry had long sought, ensuring that the Protestant Edward would inherit the throne. Edward Seymour's tenure as Lord Protector defined the early years of Edward's reign, setting in motion religious and political changes that would echo long after his death. Thomas Seymour's schemes and downfall added to the atmosphere of intrigue and danger that characterized the era, while Elizabeth Seymour's ability to survive across the reigns of multiple monarchs showed a quieter, but no less remarkable form of political acumen. Their stories also serve as a stark reminder of the dangers inherent in Tudor politics. The court was a place of dazzling opportunity, where a family could rise from relative obscurity to dominate the kingdom in a matter of years. Yet the rewards came with immense risks. The same forces that elevated the Seymours, royal favor, advantageous marriages, military success, could be turned against them with lethal consequences. An accusation of treason, a shift in factional alliances, or a loss of favor could bring even the most powerful to the scaffold. The Seymours' trajectory encapsulates this dynamic perfectly. Jane's death so soon after her triumph illustrates the fragility of personal security even for a queen. Thomas's execution shows how ambition untampered by caution could lead directly to disaster. Edward's fall demonstrates that supreme authority is often unsustainable without broad political support. Elizabeth's survival, by contrast, highlights that restraint, adaptability, and careful alliance building could allow a courtier to endure even after the destruction of close kin. The family's legacy is thus one of both ambition and survival. They were ambitious in the boldest sense, seizing every opportunity to advance their position, marrying strategically, involving themselves in the highest matters of state, and reshaping the political landscape of their time. But survival was unevenly distributed among them. For Jane, survival was never truly tested. Her brief time as queen ended with her death in childbirth. For Thomas and Edward, survival was lost to the hazards of political ambition. Only Elizabeth managed to navigate the treacherous currents of the Tudor court to live out her life in security. Historians often debate whether the Seymours were architects of their own downfall, or victims of the inherently unstable nature of Tudor politics. The answer is likely both. Their rise was accelerated by factors beyond their control. Henry's dissatisfaction with Anne Boleyn, his urgent need for a male heir, and the fortuitous timing of Jane's availability as a bride. Their fall, however, was hastened by personal miscalculations, rivalries, and an underestimation of the resilience of their opponents. In the broader sweep of Tudor history, the Seymours occupy a unique position. They were not an ancient noble family with centuries of entrenched power. They were newcomers to the highest ranks, and their moment of dominance was brief. Yet in that brief period, they influenced the succession, steered national policy, and left an enduring mark on England's religious transformation. Their story captures the essence of the Tudor era. The intoxicating allure of power, the complex interplay of personal relationships and political necessity, and the ever-present specter of danger that could turn triumph into tragedy overnight. It is perhaps this combination of brilliance and vulnerability that continues to draw attention to the Seymour legacy. They were not merely passive beneficiaries of circumstance. They actively shaped their destinies, sometimes with great skill, sometimes with fatal misjudgment. Their collective experience underscores the reality that in the Tudor court, success was never secure, and survival often depended less on the magnitude of one's achievements than on the ability to adapt to changing fortunes. The Seymours' place in history is defined by the tension between ambition and survival. Jane's quiet yet transformative queenship, Edward's commanding but ultimately doomed protectorship, Thomas's reckless pursuit of influence, and Elizabeth's enduring presence form a tapestry of intertwined lives that reflect the volatile beauty and danger of their age. Together, they embody the Tudor paradox, that the path to the highest glory was often the shortest road to destruction, and that sometimes the greatest triumph lay simply in enduring the storm. The Seymour family's story is one that still captures people's imagination centuries later, not just because of the events that shaped their lives, but because those events show us something that feels timeless about human nature. Their rise, their triumphs, and their falls all happened in the glittering but dangerous world of the Tudor court, where the rewards of ambition were great, but the risks were just as high. Even today, when we read about Jane, Edward, Thomas, and Elizabeth Seymour, we are reminded that ambition can open doors, but it can also lead to ruin if not handled carefully. The fascination begins with how quickly they rose. At the start, the Seymours were not one of England's oldest or richest noble families. They were respected gentry, with some land and some influence, but they were far from the kind of family anyone would expect to dominate royal politics. And yet, in only a few years, they were at the center of power because of one marriage, Jane Seymour's marriage to King Henry VIII. This sudden rise makes their story dramatic and exciting, like a real-life tale of luck and timing combined with careful planning. It shows how quickly lives could change in Tudor England, for better or for worse. Jane's own part in this story adds to the fascination. She was not a loud or forceful figure like Anne Boleyn before her. Instead, she was known for being gentle, modest, and obedient, qualities that Henry found appealing after his stormy relationship with Anne. Behind that gentle image, however, there was careful positioning. Jane and her family knew how to act, so that the king's attention would turn in her direction at exactly the right moment. When she married Henry in the year 1536, she stepped into a role that came with enormous responsibility. The greatest of these was to give Henry a male heir, something he had wanted for years. Jane succeeded in this when she gave birth to Prince Edward in the year 1537. But her success came at a terrible price. She died only days later. That moment, the joy of Edward's birth followed so soon by Jane's death, is one reason people still remember her. It is the kind of bittersweet turn that feels like the heart of a tragic story. It also left the Seymours in a strange position. They had no living queen in the family anymore, but they were now related by blood to the future King of England. This connection would shape everything that came after. Edward Seymour, Jane's eldest surviving brother, became the most powerful member of the family. He was already respected as a soldier and a courtier, but now he was the uncle of the heir to the throne. When King Henry died and the young Edward VI became king at only 9 years old, Edward Seymour became Lord Protector, which meant he ruled in the boy's name. For a few years, he had more power than anyone else in England. This period of power adds another layer to why their story is so compelling. Edward Seymour was able to direct the kingdom's policies, especially in religion, moving it further towards Protestantism. He also led military campaigns, such as the victory over Scotland at the Battle of Pinkie. But even at the height of his authority, danger was never far away. The very ambition that had brought Edward to the top also created enemies. Other powerful men, such as John Dudley, watched for chances to take his place. Economic problems and rebellions in the kingdom made his leadership harder to defend. Eventually, he lost his position and was executed in 1552. His downfall shows how fragile even the strongest power could be in the Tudor court. Thomas Seymour, the younger brother, makes the story even more dramatic. He was charming, ambitious, and bold, but also reckless. He married the Dowager Queen Catherine Parr, the last wife of Henry VIII, which gave him influence and prestige. However, his attempts to get close to the young Princess Elizabeth, and his plans to take more control over King Edward's life crossed the line into dangerous plotting. Thomas was arrested and executed for treason. His fate shows how quickly ambition could turn into disaster. Elizabeth Seymour, the sister, had a different kind of story. She did not hold public power like her brothers, but she showed remarkable skill in surviving through these dangerous times. She made a series of strategic marriages that kept her connected to powerful people at court. Unlike her brothers, she avoided becoming too deeply involved in risky political games. Because of this, she managed to live through all the changes in fortune her family experienced and died peacefully, still respected and secure. Her example shows that sometimes survival is not about winning the biggest prize, but about avoiding the most dangerous traps. The combination of these lives, Jane's brief queenship and tragic death, Edward's rise and fall as Lord Protector, Thomas's reckless end, and Elizabeth's long survival, creates a story full of both inspiration and warning. It inspires because it shows that people from relatively modest beginnings can rise to the very top if they seize the right chances. It warns because it shows that the higher you climb, the more dangerous your position becomes. One timeless lesson from their story is that ambition needs to be balanced with caution. Jane's ambition was quiet and carefully managed. She achieved her goal but did not live long enough to protect her position. Edward's ambition took him to the highest role in the land, but his inability to keep allies cost him everything. Thomas's ambition was unchecked and reckless, leading him straight to the executioner. Elizabeth's ambition was modest but steady. She aimed for security rather than domination, and she was the one who survived. Another lesson is that power is never truly secure, no matter how strong it seems. The Seymours' power depended heavily on their relationship to the king. When Jane died and young Edward became king, their influence was tied to his youth and vulnerability. As soon as the balance of the court shifted, their position was in danger. In the Tudor world, alliances could break, the king's favor could change, and one's enemies could rise in an instant. This uncertainty kept everyone at court under constant pressure, always watching for threats. There is also a lesson about the role of chance and timing. The Seymours' rise would not have happened without the exact set of circumstances that brought Henry's interest to Jane. They could not control Henry's dissatisfaction with Anne Boleyn or his urgent desire for a son, but they could be ready to take advantage when the opportunity appeared. This mix of luck and readiness is still a part of how success often works, even in very different times and places.
The reason their story continues to attract is that it has all the elements of a human drama: love, ambition, power, victory, and tragedy. It is also deeply tied to one of the most famous and colorful periods in English history. The Tudors have always drawn attention for their larger than life personalities, their dangerous politics, and the way the personal lives of the rulers shaped the fate of the entire country. The Seymours were right in the middle of that war, their fortune rising and falling with the shifting moods of the court. Even though centuries have passed, people can still relate to the emotions at the heart of their story. We understand the desire to rise above one's beginnings, the excitement of success, the fear of losing what we have gained, and the pain of betrayal. We can also see the truth in the idea that sometimes it is not the loudest or the most daring who win in the end, but the ones who can adapt, keep their heads down when necessary, and live to fight another day. The story of this family remains captivating because it is at once glamorous and cautionary. It invites admiration for their boldness and skill, but it also warns us of how delicate fortune can be. It shows that in a world of high skates, even the most brilliant players can be brushed away by the forces they cannot control. And it leaves us with the thought that while ambition can open the door to greatness, it is wisdom and caution that help keep that door from closing too soon.